Welcome back, everybody. In this lesson, we are going to review some elementary concepts, some basic things, just to keep them fresh. Starting with 4 basic sentence types. So please try to diagram the 4 sentences on the screen, and also see if you can identify which sentence is which type. And we will see the 4 types diagrammed out, starting with declarative. This is simply just declaring or telling something. Interrogative, which is asking a question. Imperative, which is essentially giving somebody or something a command. And then an exclamatory or excitement-filled exclamation type sentence. And you can note that imperative sentences often have an implied or an elliptical subject, which will go in parentheses. And that's when you add a word or words that aren't in the sentence but are necessary. They are implied, and they're necessary to complete the meaning of the sentence in diagram form. Next, we're going to review 4 different types of sentence structure and try to diagram the sentences on the screen. Okay, and here we see 4 types of sentence structure, beginning with a simple sentence, and that is a sentence that contains a subject and a verb, followed by a compound sentence, and that is a sentence that contains 2 clauses, in other words, subjects and verbs that are connected with some type of conjunction, yet and so. Third, we have a complex sentence, and this is when we have an independent clause, which is a sentence that can be understood on its own terms, paired with an adverb clause or a subordinate clause. In this case, we see when practice ended, and that is the dependent or subordinate clause in this sentence. It can also be known as an adverb clause, since it modifies the verb, and that's what adverbs do. When practice ended doesn't really make sense on its own. It is dependent on an independent clause. And then lastly, we see a compound complex sentence, and this is a sentence that includes both a coordinating conjunction and a subordinating conjunction. In this case, he drove home and she rode is the compound, and after practice ended is the subordinating clause, because it is dependent on the rest of the sentence to make sense. The next concept for review is the concept of subject and verb agreement, and diagramming, of course, can help us to visualize sentences and make agreeing subjects and verbs much more easy to accomplish. Please try out the next 3, and then we will review. And here we see a nice clean example of a common mistake. On the left, we see a mistake where pimples and resides is paired together as subject and verb, and we know that on the right is the proper form, because we have pimples, which is plural, and reside, which is the type of verb that pairs with a plural. When we diagram, it forces us to identify the subject and verb right from the start. Otherwise, we can't diagram correctly. And some sentences are complicated, and it's not always easy to see if the subject and verb go together properly. And here are 2 more examples where diagramming helps us see more easily whether our subjects and verbs are properly paired together. Just as a reminder, you'll want to remember that a subject can never be part of a prepositional phrase. So, of students is a prepositional phrase, and therefore students cannot be the subject of this sentence. And just for your information, these are the types of questions that are some of the trickier questions on standardized tests like this SAT example. And you'll see that these types of questions are designed to separate the subject and the verb at a sort of complicated distance away from each other. And your task would be to locate them and then see if they agree. Next, we will take a quick look at pronoun agreement or pronoun-antecedent agreement and try out these three sentences, and then we will review. In our first simple example, we see the bag of pretzels sits on their shelf versus the bag of pretzels sits on its shelf. And when we know that bag is the subject, bag is a singular thing, even if it's consisting of many individual pretzels, it's one bag. So it pairs with its as opposed to their. And just as a reminder, a prepositional phrase cannot be the subject, so pretzels could not be the subject here. In this second sentence, you'll see that his does pair with worker very nicely, but they does not pair with his. He pairs with his. So this is a sentence that allows us to see the pronouns in relationship with the antecedent. In other words, that means the word that they are referencing. Remember, pronouns are generalized terms. They're sort of replacements for other nouns. And lastly, this is a sentence from an SAT test, and we could see that although it's technically it's a complex sentence because it has a dependent clause and an independent clause, it's easy to see where the issue might be when you diagram it out. And you'll see that you would never say it established herself. You would say instead she established herself. So here we have the reflexive pronoun herself referring back to she. And she, in this case, is Doris Lessing. And one more quick peek at the concept of parallelism or parallel structure. And as a reminder, take a look at these two sentences and see if you could figure out how they might be diagrammed. And here we can see why parallelism is also called parallel structure, because we see the same structure in the shared compound verb here. So the barista steamed, brewed, and told, and more specifically, steamed milk, brewed espresso, and told jokes. So we have a past tense verb followed by a direct object, repeated 3 times in a row. In our second example, which was an example of a thesis statement, we see above all, Leone's pinpoint mood results from his groundbreaking editing, particularly in terms of its mathematical, psychological, and rhythmical elements. And here we see 3 different types of elements described. Well, this is very parallel. In this example, they are all AL adjectives. If locating the subject and the verb of a sentence is the basic foundation of diagramming, then understanding the 8 parts of speech is sort of a pre-foundation even to that. So here we have 2 sentences that include 8 different parts of speech, and see if you can label the 8 different parts of speech in each sentence. And here we could see the parts of speech in each sentence, and also how they would be diagrammed when all mapped out together. Different parts of speech serve different functions. For example, adjectives modify nouns or pronouns, adverbs modify verbs or other adverbs or adjectives, etc., etc. So it is very helpful to understand not only how to label different parts of a sentence, but to understand more foundationally what different parts of speech actually do. What are the main functions that they serve? And that's enough for now.